Eleanor Vance knew her garden was a rebellion. In a neighborhood choked by the sterile uniformity dictated by the Homeowners Association, her patch of vibrant, untamed beauty was a defiant splash of color against a canvas of beige and manicured monotony. Every morning, before the sun had fully chased away the dew, Eleanor was out there, a wide-brimmed straw hat perched on her head, dirt smudged on her cheek, orchestrating a symphony of blossoms. Her hands, gnarled and strong, had coaxed life from stubborn soil, transforming a barren suburban plot into a riotous Eden that spilled over its carefully defined borders with joyful abandon. It wasn't just a garden, it was her sanctuary, her masterpiece, a living testament to her spirit. Roses in hues of crimson and gold climbed a weathered trellis, their fragrant petals brushing against the eaves of her quaint bungalow. Lavender bushes hummed with industrious bees, their purple spikes a fragrant cloud. Heirloom tomatoes, fat and juicy, ripened on the vine, hidden amongst a tangle of vibrant nasturtiums and towering sunflowers that dared to peer over the fence at the perfectly symmetrical lawns of her neighbors. Eleanor knew each plant by heart, understood its needs, celebrated its triumphs, and mourned its fleeting beauty. This garden was her legacy, a vibrant counterpoint to the quiet solitude of her later years. The residents of Willow Creek Estates, a community built on the bedrock of conformity, viewed Eleanor's garden with a mixture of grudging admiration and thinly veiled disapproval. It was too wild, too colorful, too alive for their meticulously regulated world. But it was the Homeowners Association, a faceless entity embodied by a rotating cast of busybody board members, that truly saw it as an affront. Their bylaws, thick as a phone book and twice as tedious, detailed everything from mailbox color to the precise height of hedges. Eleanor, with her glorious, untamed flora, was a living, breathing violation. The first volley arrived not as a polite suggestion, but as a stark official notice tucked into her mailbox, its stark white paper a jarring contrast to the soft greens and vibrant reds of her overflowing flower beds. The subject line, printed in bold, unforgiving sans serif, read, "Notice of violation. Landscaping non-compliance." Eleanor, still humming a tune picked up from the chirping sparrows, unfolded it with a sigh. She knew this day would come. The letter, signed by the current HOA president, a perpetually frowning man named Mr. Henderson, who seemed to derive perverse pleasure from enforcing arbitrary rules, cited excessive growth, encroachment on common areas, and non-approved plant species. Non-approved plant species? Eleanor scoffed, scanning the list. Sunflowers exceeding 6 feet. Uncontained climbing roses. Unspecified herbaceous perennials. It was a declaration of war against her very soul. The notice demanded immediate rectification within 7 days, threatening fines and, chillingly, professional intervention if she failed to comply. Eleanor reread the last phrase, her lips pressing into a thin, grim line. Professional intervention. They meant they would send their own crew, their own sterile, soulless landscapers to hack away at her life's work, to impose their bland vision on her vibrant reality. A cold dread settled in her stomach, quickly followed by a slow, simmering anger. This wasn't about aesthetics. It was about control, about crushing anything that dared to be unique. She looked out at her garden, bathed in the soft morning light, each petal and leaf a testament to resilience. The thought of their clippers, their heavy boots trampling her delicate seedlings, sent a shiver of pure fury through her. She had poured years, sweat, and love into this place. It wasn't just dirt and plants, it was a part of her, and they wanted to destroy it. Eleanor Vance was a quiet woman, known more for her green thumb than for her fiery spirit, but as she crumpled the HOA notice in her hand, a spark ignited deep within her. They wanted to play by the rules? Fine. She knew the rules. She read every single one of them when she first moved in, long before the garden became her obsession. And she knew, with a certainty that settled like a stone in her gut, that if they dared to touch her garden, Willow Creek Estates would discover that Eleanor Vance, the quiet gardener, had a very different kind of seed to sow. A seed of disruption, of inconvenience, of a reckoning that would make their perfectly manicured lawns seem like a very small price to pay. The battle lines had been drawn, and Eleanor, for the first time in a long time, fell. The 7-day deadline loomed, a dark cloud over Eleanor's sun-drenched sanctuary. Each morning, as she tended to her beloved plants, she felt the weight of the impending invasion. Her neighbors, usually quick with a polite nod or a brief comment on the weather, now averted their eyes, their silence a testament to the HOA's pervasive influence. They were either afraid or they secretly agreed with Mr. Henderson's rigid vision of Willow Creek Estates. Eleanor didn't care which. Their inaction only solidified her resolve. She spent the first few days after receiving the notice in a quiet fury, meticulously rereading the HOA bylaws, not for compliance, but for loopholes. She highlighted sections, cross-referenced clauses, and made notes in the margins of the thick booklet. The more she read, the more she realized the bylaws, while seemingly comprehensive, were also riddled with ambiguities, and more importantly, a distinct lack of foresight regarding truly creative forms of non-compliance. They had anticipated overgrown hedges and unapproved paint colors, but they hadn't accounted for a woman whose rebellion was rooted in the very soil beneath their feet. On the fifth day, a sleek black SUV, bearing the logo of Willow Creek Estates Landscaping Services, pulled up across the street from Eleanor's house. Two men in crisp, khaki uniforms emerged, carrying clipboards and surveying her garden with clinical detachment. Eleanor watched them from her kitchen window, a cup of herbal tea growing cold in her hand. Their presence was a clear message. The HOA was serious, and so was she. That afternoon, Eleanor made a trip to the local hardware store, a place she usually frequented for organic compost and rare seed packets. Today, her shopping list was decidedly different. She purchased several large bags of fast-acting fertilizer, a dozen bags of a particularly invasive yet legal ground cover, and a surprisingly large quantity of reflective garden gnomes. Her cart, usually filled with delicate seedlings, now clanked with items that promised anything but peace and tranquility. The next morning, the sixth day, Eleanor was up before dawn. Instead of her usual gentle pruning and weeding, she embarked on a new, more strategic form of gardening. She began by liberally applying the fast-acting fertilizer to the patches of lawn directly bordering her property, both her own and subtly, the edges of her neighbor's immaculate grass. This wasn't about growing her garden, it was about accelerating growth elsewhere. Then came the ground cover. She carefully, almost surgically, planted the invasive species along the fence lines, ensuring it would quickly spread into the pristine, uniform lawns of her immediate neighbors, Mr. Henderson included. The bylaws, she recalled, the Rice Mile stipulated well-maintained lawns but made no specific mention of what constituted well-maintained when faced with a rapidly encroaching, yet technically unprohibited ground cover. There was a subtle, almost imperceptible act of sabotage, a silent invasion that would, in time, become undeniably visible. Finally, the gnomes. These weren't the quaint, traditional kind. Eleanor had chosen a collection of garishly painted, highly reflective gnomes, each one a miniature monument to kitsch. She positioned them strategically throughout her front garden, ensuring that their mirrored surfaces would catch the morning and afternoon sun, sending dazzling, disorienting flashes of light across the street and, more specifically, directly into the living room windows of Mr. Henderson and his closest allies on the HOA board. The bylaws, she knew, had nothing to say about the reflectivity of garden ornaments. As the sun rose higher, casting long shadows across her now transformed garden, Eleanor stepped back, a satisfied glint in her eye. Her garden still bloomed, perhaps even more defiantly now, but it was no longer her sole focus. She had planted seeds of a different kind, seeds of inconvenience, of subtle disruption, of a slow, creeping chaos that would soon begin to unravel the HOA's carefully constructed order. The 7-day deadline was almost up. Let them come. Eleanor Vance was ready for battle, and her weapons were far more insidious than a few overgrown roses. The morning of the 7th day dawned with an almost theatrical stillness. Eleanor, dressed in her usual gardening attire, sat on her porch swing, sipping tea and watching the street. At precisely 9 o'clock a.m., the black SUV from Willow Creek Estates Landscaping Services reappeared, this time accompanied by a white van overflowing with tools and a crew of 4 men. Mr. Henderson, looking particularly stern in a pressed polo shirt, stood beside them, clipboard in hand, clearly overseeing the operation. Eleanor watched, a strange calm settle in over her. She had anticipated this. As the crew began to unload their equipment, hedge trimmers, leaf blowers, and a large, ominous-looking mulcher, she rose and walked slowly down her driveway, stopping just at the edge of her property line, a silent sentinel guarding her vibrant domain. Mr. Henderson, noticing her presence, cleared his throat. "Good morning, Ms. Vance," he said, his voice clipped and formal. "As per the notice delivered on the 1st, and with no action taken on your part, we are here to bring your landscaping into compliance with HOA regulations." He gestured vaguely at her overflowing garden, a hint of triumph in his eyes. Eleanor offered a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "Good morning, Mr. Henderson," she replied, her voice soft but steady. "I believe you'll find I have taken action. Just perhaps not the action you anticipated." Before Mr. Henderson could respond, a sudden, blinding flash of light erupted from Eleanor's garden. One of the reflective gnomes, perfectly angled by Eleanor the day before, caught the direct rays of the rising sun, sending a searing beam directly into the eyes of one of the landscapers. The man yelped, dropping his hedge trimmer and shielding his face. A moment later, another gnome, then another began to glint, turning Eleanor's garden into a dazzling, disorienting light show. "What in the—" Mr. Henderson squinted, raising a hand to block the glare. The landscapers, now disoriented and annoyed, began to grumble, their attempts to set up equipment hampered by the sporadic flashes. Then a new problem emerged. From the edges of Mr. Henderson's meticulously manicured lawn, and indeed, From the lawns of several other HOA board members down the street, tiny vibrant green shoots began to appear. The invasive ground cover, fueled by Eleanor's strategic application of fertilizer, was making its debut. It was subtle, almost imperceptible to the casual observer, but to the trained eye of a landscaper or a homeowner obsessed with lawn perfection, it was a burgeoning nightmare. One of the landscapers, a younger man with a keen eye, knelt down at the edge of Mr. Henderson's lawn. Mr. Henderson," he called out, his voice laced with concern, "you've got some serious encroachment here. Looks like creeping Charlie, and it's spreading fast." Mr. Henderson's face, already flushed from the sun and irritation, paled slightly. He looked from the rapidly spreading green tendrils on his own lawn to Eleanor, who stood calmly, a knowing glint in her eye. The bylaws, he remembered, were very clear about maintaining one's own property. He couldn't find himself for non-compliance, but he certainly couldn't ignore it. The reflective gnomes continued their assault, and the creeping ground cover began its silent, relentless march. The landscapers, now more concerned with the unexpected issues on the neighbors' properties than Eleanor's garden, exchanged bewildered glances. The professional intervention was quickly devolving into a chaotic, sun-drenched farce. Eleanor Vance simply smiled. The price, she knew, was just beginning to be paid. The immediate aftermath of the professional intervention was a flurry of confused activity. The landscaping crew, unable to effectively work under the barrage of reflective gnome-induced flashes and increasingly distracted by the insidious spread of the ground cover, packed up their tools with a mixture of frustration and bewildered resignation. Mr. Henderson, his face a mask of barely contained fury, exchanged heated words with the crew foreman before storming back to his own house, presumably to consult the bylaws once more. Eleanor, meanwhile, returned to her porch swing, a quiet sense of satisfaction blooming within her, as vibrant as her most cherished rose. She watched as Mr. Henderson, clipboard still clutched in his hand, began to inspect his own lawn with a magnifying glass, his brow furrowed in consternation. He even bent down, plucking at a tiny tendril of the ground cover, only to find it stubbornly rooted. The next few days brought a new kind of tension to Willow Creek Estates. The reflective gnomes continued their dazzling display, turning morning coffee on many porches into a squinting exercise. Complaints began to trickle into the HOA office, not about Eleanor's garden, but about the unbearable glare and distracting reflections emanating from her property. The bylaws, as Eleanor had so carefully noted, were silent on the matter of reflective garden ornaments. More significantly, the invasive ground cover, having received its initial boost from Eleanor's fertilizer, truly began to flourish. It crept across property lines with alarming speed, a verdant tide slowly engulfing the pristine, uniform lawns that were the pride of Willow Creek Estates. Homeowners who had once prided themselves on their immaculate turf now found themselves battling a relentless, low-lying green menace. Lawnmowers struggled to cut it evenly, and attempts to pull it by hand proved futile, as it simply fragmented and spread further. The HOA board meetings, usually staid in predictable affairs, became increasingly contentious. Mr. Henderson, now facing a barrage of complaints from his own neighbors, found himself in an unenviable position. He couldn't enforce rules against Eleanor for excessive growth when his own lawn was rapidly becoming a testament to it. The irony was not lost on Eleanor, who received secondhand reports of the escalating chaos from Mrs. Gable, a kindly neighbor who secretly admired Eleanor's rebellion. "They're calling it the Vance Vine," Mrs. Gable whispered conspiratorially over the fence one afternoon, a twinkle in her eye. "Mr. Henderson is beside himself. He tried to spray it, but it just seems to make it grow faster." Eleanor merely smiled, tending to a particularly robust sunflower. She knew the ground cover wasn't truly a vine, but the name stuck, a testament to its relentless spread and Eleanor's growing reputation. The HOA, so accustomed to wielding its power unilaterally, was finding itself entangled in its own meticulously crafted web of rules. They had demanded compliance, but Eleanor had delivered a different kind of conformity, a shared, creeping green problem that united the neighborhood in a way the HOA never intended. The initial financial burden of dealing with the Vance Vine was starting to fall squarely on the homeowners, who were now facing unexpected landscaping costs. All other reflective gnomes continued their silent, dazzling protest. The price, Eleanor knew, was accumulating, one invasive tendril and one blinding flash at a time. As weeks turned into a month, the Vance Vine became a full-blown crisis for Willow Creek Estates. The ground cover, resilient and aggressive, had not only consumed the meticulously manicured lawns of the HOA board members, but had begun to leapfrog, carried by birds and wind, to other properties throughout the community. Homeowners, who had initially dismissed it as a minor annoyance, were now facing significant bills from landscapers attempting to eradicate it, often with limited success. The uniform green carpets they so prized were now patchy, uneven, and riddled with the unwelcome tendrils of Eleanor's silent protest. The reflective gnomes, too, continued their relentless assault. What had started as a minor irritation had escalated into a genuine nuisance. Residents complained of glare interfering with their television viewing, making outdoor activities uncomfortable, and even causing temporary blindness for drivers turning onto Eleanor Street at certain times of day. The HOA's attempts to issue new bylaws regarding excessive reflectivity were met with widespread derision. After all, they had been so quick to dismiss Eleanor's initial concerns about her garden. The pressure on the HOA board, particularly Mr. Henderson, became immense. Emergency meetings were called, often devolving into shouting matches as homeowners demanded solutions and accountability. The community's pristine image, a cornerstone of its property values, was visibly deteriorating. Real estate agents reported a noticeable dip in interest for homes in Willow Creek estates, with potential buyers citing the unusual landscaping issues and known problem as deterrents. The very value of their houses, once a source of pride, was now paying the price for the HOA's rigid adherence to rules and its heavy-handed approach to Eleanor's garden. One sweltering afternoon, Eleanor was watering her prize-winning sunflowers when she saw Mr. Henderson approaching her house, not with a clipboard this time, but with a defeated slump to his shoulders. He looked haggard, his usually impeccable polo shirt slightly rumpled. He stopped at the edge of her property, avoiding the glare of the gnomes. "Ms. Vance," he began, his voice devoid of its usual clipped authority, "we need to talk. This situation is untenable." Eleanor straightened out, the faint smile playing on her lips. "Is it, Mr. Henderson? I thought everything was perfectly compliant with the bylaws." He winced. "Look, we understand you're upset about your garden. And we admit, perhaps we were a bit zealous in our enforcement." He paused, visibly struggling to swallow his pride. "The board has decided to offer a compromise. If you could remove the ground cover from our properties and perhaps reposition the gnomes, we would be willing to revisit your original landscaping notice. We would even consider amending the bylaws to allow for more diverse plant life." Eleanor looked at him, then at her flourishing garden, and finally at the distant patchy lawns of her neighbors. The Vance vine was a powerful negotiator. "Mr. Henderson," she said, her voice still soft, but with an underlying steel, "my garden is my sanctuary. It always has been. All I ever wanted was to be left alone to cultivate it as I saw fit." She paused, letting the silence hang in the air. "I'm willing to consider your offer, but it won't be a compromise. It will be a new understanding. One where the beauty of individuality is respected, not stifled." Mr. Henderson nodded, a flicker of something akin to relief in his eyes. He knew he was beaten. Eleanor Vance, the quiet gardener, had not only saved her garden but had, in her own unique way, reseeded the entire community with a new appreciation for the wild, untamed spirit that had always been missing from Willow Creek estates. The price had been paid, not in fines but in the collective realization that true beauty and true community could not be dictated by a rulebook.